Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 70, for the week ending September 19th, 2017, the Pay for Shoes edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I return for a wide-ranging discussion of some of the week's top compliance and ethics-related stories. They include the DOJ announcement of a major criminal case which rocked the world of college athletics involving pay for shoe scandal in college basketball. We take a look at whether consumer product sellers need to check the SDN list before making a shipment in the context of the Cartier OFAC settlement. We look at the Alere FCPA and accounting fraud SEC settlement. I consider how McKinsey in South Africa reminds us that a promise to pay can be an FCPA violation. We take a look at an article by Todd Haugh, an assistant professor of business ethics at Business Law and Ethics at Indiana University, on rationalizations and behavioral best practices. We consider Uber and its continued problems in London. We look at the Equifax data breach and couple it with the news of the SEC hacking. We review some of the top baseball highlights of the week. I consider the podcast series, 1 month to a more effective compliance program, for my October edition, which will be business ventures in the M&A context, sponsored by the Volkov Law Group. And Jay previews his weekend report. It's a fascinating episode. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a little bit longer than normal because Jay and I really got going on a roll. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA, a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 70, for the week ending September 29th, 2017, the Pay for Shoes edition. As always, I'm joined by Mr. Monitor, Jay Rosen, and we are back for a wide-ranging discussion of some of the week's top compliance and ethics-related stories. So, Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. We got a lot on our plate, so let's jump right in.
So it's tangentially FCPA, but certainly bribery and corruption in maybe one of the biggest stories for some time to come, Jay, which is the Department of Justice announced a major criminal case which rocked the world of college athletics. It involves pay for shoes scandal, but it's, I think, going to be much broader than that. 4 assistant coaches, former executive of Adidas Shoes, and multiple financial advisors, agents, and hanger-oners around college athletics, high school athletics, and probably some pro athletes were all ensnared in a huge undercover operation by the Department of Justice. It generally involved the payment to high school athletes and or their families to move them towards certain NCAA universities, member universities, which had contracts with shoe companies. And right now they're focused on Adidas, so that's probably the one we'll talk about the most. But this, following on the heels of FIFA 2 years ago, this case may literally blow the lid off the NCAA, amateurism in college football, alleged amateurism, pay for play, and may ruin a lot of careers of college coaches. I know we're going to talk about this at some length, but do you have just maybe a few initial observations from a high level?
Yeah, I've been researching this all week, and I came up with a name from the past that I'm sure you'll know. There's a gentleman named Sonny Vaccaro.
My main man, Sonny.
Who used to work with Nike, and he left the Nike brand and then went to Adidas. And, this is not new behavior. It's systemic. And initially it started on the high school level. That, if Nike could come in and get the Manchester Central High Little Green to wear Nike shoes, that the kids in the school would wear what their kids on their high school basketball team was wearing. And then they decided to take that up to the college level, and then they took it up to the pro level. So, at some point, the NCAA has always been in a very lucrative relationship with the equipment manufacturers, and for that matter, all the professional sports leagues as well. I mean, there was a point where I remember Reebok got the right to outfit the NFL uniforms, and that was a huge opportunity to rebrand and put new logos on and change design. So it's nothing new. I think it's always been the dark underbelly. But I think my question for you, Tom, that we could hopefully unpack a bit is, why wasn't this something that the NCAA could have policed itself? Why did it have to go out to the FBI and the DOJ? So that's question number one. And number two is, what are the similarities and the differences that you would see in this matter compared to the FIFA matter that's been going around for the last couple of years?
I see a relationship, Jay, and it may answer or provide at least some light on your first question. And that is, FIFA basically had no oversight, no national regulatory body, no government, no one prosecutorial service had oversight. And so they were able to run corruptly rampant for many, many years until they fell afoul of other laws such as money laundering, tax evasion, etc. And the NCAA member schools, it's different because there's obviously some oversight, but it's once again sports is really in a gray area of regulation. And they've been sports grew up organically in for the most part. International Olympic Committee, FIFA, Major League Baseball, the NFL. Although they've been helped obviously by certain legislation, nevertheless, most regulators have taken a more of a hands-off approach to sports, except in the area of safety. And so we have the rather anomalous situation of a literally multi-billion-dollar industry that is almost essentially self-regulated. And that's where the NCAA comes in. The NCAA regulates its members through the members' own rules. And frankly, there's probably not the political will to do this at the NCAA. And much as with the Swiss or whatever regulatory body would be over FIFA, there was no will to regulate FIFA. One of my wife's cousins told me after the FIFA scandal broke, was along the lines of, I really don't care whatever you think about the Americans, but at least they did something. And corruption in FIFA was well known. Corruption in NCAA is well known. I remember my father and my uncles laughing about it, and they went to college in the 40s. So it's nothing new, but the scale of money that's involved is just astronomical. And so literally, as you said, you have apparel companies paying high school coaches to put shoes on their high school athletes because that influences people in the local community or the high school. That's the kind of dollars you're talking about that you can drive that sort of influence down at literally a 13 to 16-year-old individual consumer basis. So it really speaks to the amount of money. And when you overlay that with a system, and I mean, William Rhodes, formerly the sports columnist of the New York Times, called it a plantation system, where essentially colleges are, for the cost of a scholarship, are garnering millions of dollars from their athletic programs, certainly in football and basketball. And then, of course, the pro sports get a feeder of apprentices who they don't have to pay for any of their training, and they get, in basketball, it's one and done. In football, it's a little more of the apprenticeship because most 18 or 19-year-olds are not physically ready to play professional football with a man in his mid-20s. Baseball has a 2-year rule that they won't go after a college athlete his first 2 years in college, although they can if he's not drafted out of high school. So the professional sports teams have largely had this talent pool that's not funded by them. So, of course, they have an interest in maintaining the system. But the bottom line is the universities are making millions of dollars off these kids, and the kids are getting basically nothing. And certainly in the one and done situation, they're getting nothing. And so, and now let's overlay the socioeconomic facts of who makes the best basketball players. It's typically not the white guy Jay Rosen and Tom Fox of the world, even in high school, probably. Certainly in my case, it wasn't true. I
don't want to discount Millie Rosen's debut for the Valley Beth Shalom Lions, where she scored 6 points the other day.
Now, was that 6 out of 10 total?
6 out of 16.
So, and then I should probably note that in one junior high game, I was my team's leading scorer with 5 points out of the 13 we scored. So,
awesome.
Yes, and that's probably the exact word my coach used. Awesome. Although he may have had
the one thing I also want to throw in, I think we're taking a little bit more time, but this is good stuff. What we're really going to be bouncing up against with the NCAA is the definition of an amateur. And if you go all the way back to Jim Thorpe, who was just an incredible athlete in his time, he ended up having to sacrifice Olympic medals that he won because I think he took some money for playing some semi-professional baseball. So this NCAA thing is going to be deeper down the rabbit hole. And, those 3 sportswear companies and Rick Pitino are just the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. And we have some more thoughts on that later, but we've got a lot to go over. So we ought to move on. The next thing, there was a OFAC enforcement action, and it may seem surprising, although when you think about it, it's probably not so surprising, and it involves Cartier jewelers. And the company got into trouble because they sold jewelry and shipped jewelry to someone on the specially designated national list, which is a huge no-no. And it really drove home, Jay, the requirement that not only do banks and financial institutions have to know KYC, know your customer, but here we have a jeweler, a high-end jeweler, nonetheless, obviously, and it was very expensive jewelry. Nevertheless, that can be a way to launder money. So between a financial institution, you name the bank, and a Cartier jeweler, there's billions or at least millions of entities in between. And so one of the things that I've really been trying to talk about is the need for compliance in AML compliance, money laundering compliance in commercial non-financial institutions. And I think the Cartier OFAC enforcement action really speaks of that, although Cartier was obviously is a high-end product, but whether it's real estate, whether it's horses, you name the high-end consumer product, that could easily go to a high-end piece of equipment that a SDN or person on the PEP list could try to launder money through.
Do you think this might affect the Fox's famous leather goods company?
That's a great point. I may have to speak to the owner about the AML KYC program.
EC FCPA settlement this week. There is a pharmaceutical and medical company in Massachusetts called Alere, and they have settled with the SEC to pay $13 million to resolve some accounting fraud and FCPA offenses that came mainly in India and Colombia. What's your read on this one, Tom?
So here, once again, we have a company who's gotten into trouble, FCPA trouble where there's no evidence of bribes, but violations of the books and records. The accounting provisions, including books and records and internal controls. So we have improper revenue recognition at several subsidiaries, and we also have ineffective internal controls around payment of monies to third parties. It is alleged that the third parties made improper payments to improper offers to government officials for the purposes of making sales of the company's products. So I guess, Jay, the thing that really struck me about this case is it really showed the difference in quality of the FCPA enforcement action with Telia. And when I say quality, I mean, if you think of FCPA enforcement actions in a line, and TILA, of course, is at the top because it's the largest. But if you go down with all the numbers of fines and penalties, you see here with Alere, which, of course, we have to note is Massachusetts-based, there's a spectrum or a continuum of FCPA violations. And this one is almost a regulatory violation. In fact, it is a regulatory violation administered by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so you see really when you have a systemic, corrupt series of acts at the highest level of a company, how the company can get in trouble and why the fine and penalty is so high, down to something like Alere, which is I don't want to say a technical violation, but a violation of books and records, regulatory violation, settled through an administrative order with a fine and penalty at $13 million total, although that $13 million total is both for revenue recognition and ineffective internal controls. So I thought it was very interesting. I'm going to take a little more deep dive into it next week on a blog post. The company's foreign subsidiaries in both Colombia and India were involved. So lots of interesting things to unpack from this case. And kudos to the Securities and Exchange Commission for resolving another case. And
I'd just like to throw out one other point on there. I think part of the reason this got resolved was this was to avoid a basic successor liability issue, because the company was in an agreement to be purchased by Abbott, which is a huge Chicago-based pharmaceutical firm. So I have a feeling that these issues maybe came up during due diligence, and as part of preventing any successor liability, Alere needed to clean up their act so they could be acquired by Abbott.
We should also note that in March 2016, Alere said that it had received a grand jury subpoena from the Department of Justice for documents relating to its sales practices in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That DOJ investigation apparently is still open. The press release, neither the Alere's press release nor the SEC's press release referred to the DOJ investigation, so there may be other matters related to the FCPA on a criminal matter that are still being investigated by the Department.
Great. Next up, is it your article in Compliance Week?
Yes.
A promise to pay.
A promise to pay, Jay. This is part of the ongoing sort of series of reputational miasma that is going on in South Africa right now around the President Zuma, and a family that's very close to him, the Gupta family. There was a British PR firm, Bell Pottinger, who basically went bankrupt when it turned out and went into receivership when it turned out they were doing work for the president and the Guptas, and that work was to stoke racial tensions. Well, now we've had KPMG and McKinsey come under scrutiny. KPMG for fouling up some audits of the Gupta family, which they've now resigned as the family's corporate auditor. But McKinsey did a deal with the current South African government where, for what even McKinsey itself said was an exorbitant fee, they were going to advise the state-owned electric company on restructuring. They were required to utilize a black economic partner. It's in South Africa called a Black Economic Enterprise, BEE or B, but a local content partner. And they were directed by the electric company to a local content partner called Eskom. Eskom was controlled by the Gupta family. McKinsey completed part of the contract with the state-owned enterprise, but the contract was terminated when McKinsey did not conclude a contract with Eskom, the local content provider. So the question I pose in the FCPA blog article, or the question I really explored, is that when a FCPA violation obviously occurs when you make a payment to obtain something, but it's also when you offer. So the question, because McKinsey has stated publicly that they did nothing to violate the FCPA, so I raised the question, was there an offer? made, which would also be an FCPA violation. The bottom line, Jay, for any U.S. company doing business in South Africa is you need to really go in and take a very hard look at your operations. South Africa is moving to become one of the most corrupt countries on earth. And President Zuma, I think, has lots of allegations of corruption around him. The Gupta family, numerous allegations of corruption. And if you are not taking a look at your operations, I think you're really missing a true high-risk area that is becoming more risky each day. The Bell Potner case is one of the most damaging in terms of the impact of reputational damage that we've seen ever, simply because literally within weeks, a worldwide PR firm went into receivership because of their actions. I don't think that's going to befall McKinsey or KPMG. Nevertheless, it could be costly if for both of those entities. And if you're doing business in South Africa with a state-owned enterprise, you better be taking a look at all of your controls, taking a look at your agents, seeing what they've the due diligence that was performed on them, looking at the contracts, really going through the full investigative process to see if you've got any problems.
You found a real great article that was in the MIT Sloan Management Review, and it's called "The Trouble with Corporate Compliance Program." What was it that made this article stand out to you?
So this is by a fellow named Todd Haugh. He's an assistant professor of business law and ethics at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. And he took a look at rationalizations that employees make before, during, and after they engage in fraud. And he concluded that even a best practices compliance program fails to take into account behavioral best practices. And that one of the most important things that he feels a company can do is to help eliminate rationalizations that would come up from time to time by employees. He pointed to properly, I thought, the Wells Fargo scandal, which occurred in large part because of multiple rationalizations at multiple levels. Certainly at the senior management level, there were rationalizations, but there were rationalizations at the employee level as they were pressured to violate both company policy and the law by their managers. He had we had several prescriptions, but I found two really very interesting, Jay. The first was that companies should actually employ a behavioral specialist to take account of current research and theory into practice for an organization. The second was to use behavioral best practices to eliminate rationalizations. And he gave two examples that struck me. The first is on a gifts, travel, and entertainment reimbursement form, to put at the top of the form something along the lines of an attestation that the following information is true and correct. Not at the bottom, but before you do it. And research has found that if you do it beforehand, you get a better, more accurate information. The second thing, which is not something we're really focused on in the compliance community, is that incentives to do business ethically and in compliance are viewed as a part of a best practice compliance program. But Haugh took a step back and said, sometimes it's really just a pat on the back. It's an acknowledgement in a non-monetary way. It's an acknowledgement in front of your peers. It's an acknowledgement with a trophy or something that's not money, that you're doing a good job. And I really thought about that a lot, because obviously the cost of that is much, much lower. But how many times in your corporate experience did you get a, attaboy, a thank you, a pat on the back? And if you did, the few times that happened to me, that really did make a difference. So it was a very thought-provoking article. A lot of things that we typically don't use or don't think about in the compliance space, and I hope we do start thinking about them.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was pretty cool was the way he almost described a just-in-time message. So when you're filling out a T&E report, or you're doing an attestation, when they send that thing to you and ask you to sign it, suddenly you know that you should be listening to your ethics and compliance system and making the right choice. And I think in the past, people have always spoken about, can you capability to deliver that ethics and compliance message at the moment where something might go wrong. So it's very interesting how he took the behavioral perspective and also kind of figured out to how do you wire this into an actual control to lead somebody to the right decision.
Absolutely. So our friends Uber are back in the news. Imagine that. And
the shift to Lyft.
Shift to Lyft. And in 1 week, Jay, I thought we saw some very interesting, an interesting dichotomy. So for anyone who doesn't anyone who has shifted to Lyft, but Uber lost its license to drive or provide cars in London, and over the weekend they went on a full bore attack. They attacked the mayor of London. They attacked the cabbies in London. They attacked the regulatory system in London. They attacked the government for basically saying that you're going to put numerous Londoners out of business. But it was a full-bore attack, and frankly, it's what you expect from Uber. Yet on, I think it was Wednesday of this week, maybe even Tuesday, the new CEO of Uber took a completely different tack. And it's the tact I hoped that they would have taken to start with, but at least he took it, which was to apologize. And he apologized for the mistakes that Uber had made. What the City of London basically had said is, it's not the individual offenses that has caused you to lose your license. It's that you're not fit and proper. And if fit and proper means you run a business that doesn't violate the law, let alone ethically, Uber's not it. And he properly recognized that. So I thought it was a great first step. The mayor of London responded, thanking him for it and encouraging negotiations. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the situation will be worked out. But it was simply because the new CEO took a new tone and a new tact. And I think it really points to what needs to come from a CEO when faced with this sorts of situation.
Great. So I think now we're going to go. Do we have time to do a little cybersecurity, or do you want to getting to the?
We have to do cybersecurity.
Okay, go for it then.
So,
all right. So we have two articles.
I think everybody knows Equifax was breached, and we had the new. We've had one resignation of the CEO. The new CEO formally apologized and made some amends in an editorial on the Wall Street Journal. But it turns out the SEC was hacked as well. So Joe Mount reported in Compliance Week on the SEC hack. Matt Kelly, in his continuing reports on SEC Chairman Jay Clayton, talked about Clayton's testimony before Congress. On this hack and other matters in radical compliance. So a paramount to unpack there. You want to talk about some baseball?
I guess my first, I wanted to add one thing to the cybersecurity thing. You and I, we have an institutional memory about what happened to our parents with runs on banks. Do we think with all these cyber hacks that are happening that at some point this could really be a systemic failure for our banking system? And, I'm looking at our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico who, if they don't have cash, they're not able to pay overinflated prices for their basic necessities. So how far does this cybersecurity situation, how perilous is it for our economy going forward?
Well, when he was FBI director, James Comey said there are two classes of businesses, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. So it may be the new reality, and it's how do you defend it. So
Tom, last night, the Houston Astros made a visit to Fenway Park. Can you tell everyone what happened?
Yes, the Astros stomped. Let me repeat that. Stomped the what's the name of the team up there? Oh, yeah, the Red Sox, 12-2 in the first of a 3-game series. Astros now have 99 wins, second most wins of all time. Earlier this week, second baseman Jose Altuve reached 200 hits, although I would note he had 3 last night, for the fourth straight season, becoming the fourth second baseman to do so in the history of Major League Baseball. Also, he clinched the AL top hitter for the third time in 4 years. And I think an MVP award should be not far behind. But even with the Red Sox loss, their magic number is down to 1, Jay. So I assume over the weekend they'll clinch at least a playoff spot. We should note for our Cubby fans listening, the Cubs have clinched. They're back in it. So maybe we'll have a really just a NL World Series with the Astros playing the hated Dodgers, the beloved Cubs, or maybe even the Nationals. So lots of baseball, very exciting time for the baseball playoffs, and hopefully we'll get to see some games in Las Vegas.
Yeah, that'd be great. So a quick one, I'm normally known as a full-time Boston apologist, but I'd like to go back into the Wayback Machine about 3 years ago when the Astros were not as successful as they are now. And there was an ethics and compliance commentator in Houston who was not as complimentary towards the organization and the team. Do you know who we might be talking about?
I think that person has left the field. He was just shamed out of all future commentary.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the NFL. You got any rants for me?
I thought the NFL weekend started with a Pakistani immigrant linking arms with his team in London to show solidarity. The NFL week ended with Jerry Jones linking arms with his team before the national anthem. And I found the solidarity from the ownership class and the worker class, i.e. the players, to be an extraordinary statement that I have not seen in quite some time.
Awesome. Well, what I wanted to not kind of rant, but I wanted to leave as a parting thought is that tonight at sundown begins one of the holiest days in the Jewish religious calendar, Yom Kippur, and it begins a period of 24 hours self-reflection and to think about, how you acted in the year before and how you will act in the year going forward. And part of the liturgy says that on Yom Kippur, all sins between man and God or woman and God are immediately erased and you get a clean slate. But any sins between people, so, if I've got something festering between you, we have to square it ourselves. And if we don't square it ourselves, it's never going to get taken care of. And I choose to offer these remarks in the sense of just the hyper-politicized environment that we have out there. And I think all of us, if we can figure out a way to have intelligent debate and to not just put an R or a D on somebody, then hopefully we will be living in a much better world. So that is my hope for the weekend, and my hope is that I can make it through the fast in good shape. But my thought would be is if we can take time to listen to each other and debate and agree to disagree, and maybe this NFL thing is the start of it. There's certainly self-interest for the owners. But let's see if this is a movement that we can move forward into having some dialogue that will make a difference in the coming year.
So a couple of things I want to end on, Jay. The first is today is the last day of the 1 month or more effective compliance program dealing with innovation and compliance. This month's sponsor has been Oversight Systems. And next month, I start a new program, or a new 1 month series, and I'm going to take a look at compliance with business ventures. So this is in the mergers and acquisition context, joint ventures, distributors, channel ops partners, teaming agreements, and all other manner of business ventures. In the first week, I take a deep dive on M&A under the FCPA, and I'm really proud to announce the October month sponsors is the Volkov Law Group. So if you're interested in how you can do better compliance in a business venture setting, this will be the month for you. And I know holiday weekend is going to be probably paramount on your mind, but any weekend report or anything you've been thinking about that you're going to talk to us about next week?
Yeah, I'm noodling on, I got a title for this week's report, which is draining the swamp and swimming with the sharks. So I'm going to take a look at the ethical atmosphere that is in this country and in Washington, D.C. Take a look at HHS Secretary Price's proclivity for flying on private jets, and kind of taking a look at a story from my past when I was working in the studio system. So hopefully I can bring that all together and put it into some type of cogent piece for this for my weekend read.
So it looks like we've gone a little bit longer than normal, but we had a lot to unpack. You want to take us home?
On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for spending a few minutes and taking a look at the week in FCPA that was for the week ending September 29th, 2007.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you listen to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only weekly FCPA Compliance and Ethics podcast wrap-up. Also, if you have any questions, you can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed episode 70 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending September 29th, 2017, and I hope you will join us again next week for another episode of This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.